If you ever see a Valari Leopard drowning, I used to tell every rookie ranger who joined our station, keep flying and pretend you never saw it. That was the first rule of survival on Kilos 9 because every child in this sector grew up hearing stories about those enormous alien predators. They were fast enough to outrun armored transports, strong enough to tear through mining machinery, and fearless enough to challenge creatures twice their size. We believed there was nothing in the galaxy more dangerous than a desperate Valari. We were wrong. The most dangerous thing I ever witnessed was a human who decided that a drowning predator deserved to live. My name is Sarai Voss, and I watched the entire disaster unfold from Rescue Tower 7. The storm had rolled across the valley without warning, turning a calm river into a wall of black water that swallowed trees, cargo containers, and half the eastern shoreline. Emergency drones filled the air while every rescue frequency screamed with overlapping reports. Then my scanner locked onto a heat signature moving against the current. At first I thought it was debris, but the image sharpened and my blood ran cold. A full-grown Valari Leopard was trapped beneath the twisted frame of a collapsed survey shuttle. One rear leg was tangled in fractured support cables while muddy water slammed against its body over and over again. Even from hundreds of yards away I could hear it roar. It was not roaring at us. It was roaring toward the riverbed beneath it, diving again and again instead of escaping, as if something below mattered more than its own life. Before anyone could understand what it was doing, another warning flashed across my display. 3 armed hunting drones entered the canyon from the north, descending in perfect formation. Their targeting lasers settled on the struggling predator. "Do not engage," I shouted across the emergency channel. "There are rescue teams in the area." Nobody answered. The first plasma burst struck the water only a few feet away, throwing a wave over the trapped animal. Every instinct told me the leopard would abandon whatever it was protecting and flee. Instead, it forced itself underwater again. That was when I noticed someone sprinting toward the cliff above the river. He wore no combat armor, only a weather-stained rescue jacket with the Blue Earth Expedition patch across one shoulder. Mason Reed never slowed down. He looked once at the river, once at the drones, then clipped a safety line to his harness. "Human, stand down," I yelled through the loudspeaker. "That thing will tear you apart." He glanced toward my tower for less than a second, calm enough to make me question whether he had even heard me. "Then stop shooting at him," he answered. Before another warning could leave my mouth, Mason pushed off the edge of the cliff. The drones instantly shifted their targeting beams away from the predator and onto the falling human. Watching him disappear into the raging river beneath a sky filled with hostile machines, I remember thinking I was about to witness the shortest rescue attempt in recorded history. I had no idea that I was actually watching the moment an entire sector would begin rewriting everything it believed about humans. The river swallowed Mason so completely that even my thermal scanner lost him for almost 4 seconds. 4 seconds might not sound like much, but in floodwater moving nearly 40 miles per hour, it felt like an eternity. Every rescue officer around me assumed the same thing. The human had made a fatal mistake. Then a faint signal appeared beneath the surface, moving directly toward the trapped Valari instead of back to open water. I zoomed the display until the image blurred with static. Mason was swimming through a maze of broken metal beams and twisted support cables while fighting a current strong enough to roll construction vehicles downstream. Above him, the hunting drones circled patiently, unable to get a clean shot through the churning water. The Valari spotted Mason almost immediately. Its golden eyes locked onto him, and every muscle in its massive body tightened. I had seen that posture before. It was the instant before a territorial warning. My hands froze over the control panel because I knew exactly what should happen next. A frightened apex predator did not thank strangers. It defended itself first and sorted out intentions later. Mason kept moving anyway. He never rushed. He never reached toward the animal's head. Instead, he followed the trapped cable all the way to the crushed landing gear that had wrapped itself around the Valari's rear leg. He pulled a compact rescue cutter from his belt and began slicing through the first strand. The current slammed both of them against the wreckage. The cable snapped free. The second strand held. The Valari suddenly lunged toward him. Even through the cloudy water, I could see enormous jaws closing around Mason's left shoulder. Every officer in my tower gasped at the same time. Mason did not strike back. He did not reach for a weapon. He braced one boot against the broken hull, held the rescue cutter steady with his free hand, and finished cutting the last cable before pushing both himself and the animal upward with everything he had left. They burst through the surface together in a wave of spray, just as another drone fired. The plasma bolt missed by only a few feet, exploding harmlessly against the river behind them. Mason wrapped one arm around a floating section of hull, while the Valari struggled beside him, exhausted and confused. I opened the emergency channel again. "Move away from it now," I shouted. "You have done enough." Mason looked toward the shoreline, but never released the floating wreckage that kept the predator above water. He caught his breath once before answering. "He is not trying to escape." I frowned. Nothing about that sentence made sense. The Valari was finally free. Every survival instinct should have driven it toward the forest. Instead, it twisted around, ignored the open river, and dove beneath the surface again. Mason stared after it for less than a heartbeat before taking one deep breath and following it back into the darkness. That was the moment I stopped believing this was simply a rescue. Whatever waited beneath that river was important enough for a legendary predator to risk everything twice, and somehow the human had realized it before the rest of us had. By the time Mason disappeared beneath the river for the second time, every rescue pilot had stopped talking. The command channel that had been filled with warnings only moments earlier had fallen completely silent. We were all watching the same sensor feed, trying to understand why both the human and the Valari kept returning to the bottom instead of escaping the flood. My scanner barely picked up their movements through the layers of mud and shattered metal, but one detail stood out immediately. The predator was no longer swimming at random. It followed a fixed path with absolute purpose, weaving between broken beams until it reached the remains of the survey shuttle buried beneath the riverbed. Mason followed only a few feet behind, conserving every movement instead of fighting the current. It looked less like a rescue and more like he was learning from the creature itself. Then another signal appeared. It was weak, unstable, and almost completely hidden beneath the damaged hull. I checked the display twice because I assumed it was an equipment error. It was not. There was another power source beneath the wreckage. Mason noticed it at nearly the same moment. He brushed away layers of floating debris and revealed what looked like the corner of a sealed emergency compartment wedged beneath the collapsed shuttle. The Valari immediately placed one enormous paw against the metal door, then looked directly at Mason. I had never seen a predator make eye contact like that. It was not threatening him. It was asking him to understand. Mason reached the compartment and wiped away enough sediment to expose a small emergency indicator. The light was still blinking, weakly but steadily. Whatever was inside had somehow survived the crash. Before Mason could inspect the hatch, every warning alarm inside my tower activated at once. The hunting drones had received reinforcements. 4 more aircraft crossed above the canyon, their scanning beams sweeping across the river in perfect formation. A calm voice echoed across every emergency frequency. "Rescue personnel are ordered to withdraw immediately. This operation is now under Dravic authority." Nobody at our station recognized the authorization code they transmitted. They were not rescue officials. They had simply decided to sound like them. Mason heard the announcement through his communication headset, but he ignored it completely. Instead, he searched around the emergency compartment until he found a manual release lever bent beneath a steel support beam. He wedged both hands beneath the twisted metal and pushed. Nothing moved. He changed his footing against the riverbed, inhaled once through the last remaining air in his emergency mask, and tried again. This time the beam shifted just enough for the release mechanism to unlock with a dull metallic sound. The compartment door opened only a few inches before debris trapped it again, but that narrow opening was enough. A tiny hand reached through the gap. I stared at the screen, convinced that exhaustion had begun affecting my vision. It was not the paw of an animal. It was the hand of a child. The Valari lowered its head beside the opening with a softness I would never have believed possible from such a feared predator. Mason froze for only a heartbeat before placing one hand against the damaged hatch, silently promising whoever was inside that he was not leaving. At that exact moment, one of the drones locked onto their position, and the river around them glowed with the reflection of targeting lights descending through the water. The targeting lights cut through the muddy water like pale blue spears, sweeping slowly across the wreckage until they stopped only a few feet above Mason and the sealed compartment. I reached for the emergency broadcast controls and demanded that every rescue aircraft identify the unknown drones. The answer came before anyone else could respond. A transport shuttle descended through the rain and hovered above the flooded valley with mechanical precision. Its engines barely made a sound, but the insignia on its hull sent a chill through every officer in my tower. Dravik Authority. I had heard the name before in scattered reports from distant systems, always connected to missing wildlife surveys and unexplained disappearances, but never this close to civilized space. A calm voice replaced every emergency transmission. This location is now classified. Leave immediately. None of our rescue crews moved. Neither did Mason. Through the distorted camera feed, I watched him pull harder against the damaged hatch until another section finally shifted free. The opening widened just enough for water to rush inside before he forced the emergency seal to stop halfway. He looked through the narrow gap, and for the first time since he entered the river, his expression changed. It was not fear. It was disbelief. The weak power signal had not been coming from survival equipment alone. Inside the compartment sat 3 young Valari no larger than mountain lions, pressed together against the far wall, while beside them knelt a young female whose silver markings matched the enormous guardian outside. She wrapped one arm around the frightened cubs and looked directly at Mason without saying a word. The translation display inside my tower struggled to identify her language before finally producing a single sentence. Please do not let them take my family. Everything suddenly fit together. The desperate dives, the refusal to escape, the impossible determination of a predator willing to drown rather than abandon the compartment. Razek had never been protecting territory. He had been protecting his children and his daughter. Mason slowly placed one hand against the edge of the damaged hatch and answered with remarkable calm. I am getting all of you out. He did not make promises he could not keep. He simply stated it as though it were the next step in an ordinary rescue. Before he could free the compartment completely, another voice echoed across the river from powerful external speakers. Human, it said, step away from our property. I turned every camera toward the shoreline. A tall armored figure had emerged from the transport shuttle surrounded by disciplined security personnel wearing polished combat suits. The man removed his helmet with deliberate confidence, revealing sharp gray eyes and a faint smile that never reached them. Commander Varek Thorn looked down at the flooded river as though the entire rescue operation were an inconvenience delaying his schedule. The animal belongs to us, he continued. The juveniles belong to us. The survivor belongs to us. Walk away, and you may leave this planet. Mason looked toward the surface, then back at the frightened family trapped inside the compartment. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he examined the bent locking mechanism, measured the remaining debris with one careful glance, and secured another rescue strap around the emergency hatch. Only then did he activate his communicator. Negative, he said quietly. They are survivors. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Even Commander Varek seemed surprised by how simple the reply had been. Then his smile disappeared completely, and I realized the rescue mission had just become something far more dangerous than a natural disaster. Commander Varek Thorn did not raise his voice after Mason refused him. Somehow that made the silence even heavier. Rain continued falling across the flooded valley, while every rescue crew waited for someone else to make the next move. Varek slowly folded his hands behind his back as though he were discussing shipping permits instead of living beings. You misunderstand the situation, he said. Those specimens are under licensed recovery. They are valuable because they are rare. I watched Mason through the underwater cameras as he secured another rescue strap around the damaged compartment door. He did not even look toward the commander while he worked. They have names, he answered. That makes them survivors, not cargo. Varek sighed almost patiently before nodding toward 4 members of his security team standing near the shoreline. They stepped forward carrying restraint equipment instead of heavy weapons, clearly expecting the rescue to end in seconds. They entered the shallow edge of the river with complete confidence, convinced that one exhausted human could not delay a trained recovery unit. Mason climbed onto the twisted hull of the wreck just as the first officer reached him. The officer extended a restraint band and spoke with practiced courtesy. Please cooperate. Mason glanced at the band, then at the flooded compartment beside him. I cannot do that. The officer reached for Mason's arm. What happened next lasted only a few seconds. Mason shifted one step to the side, allowing the rushing current to carry the officer off balance before calmly catching the restraint band as it slipped free. The second officer hurried forward to assist, but the unstable footing on the submerged wreck worked against him as well. Mason guided both of them safely away from the compartment and toward a floating rescue platform where they landed without serious injury, more surprised than harmed. None of us in the tower expected that outcome. He had not attacked anyone. He had simply understood the river better than they did. The remaining officers stopped advancing. Varek's expression hardened for the first time. Interesting, he said quietly. Earth training. Mason tightened another rescue line around the emergency hatch. Flood rescue, he replied. You should try helping instead. No one answered him. Instead, two compact utility drones descended toward the compartment, their mechanical arms extending to seize the damaged hatch. Before they could reach it, the enormous Valari emerged from beneath the water once again. Razek did not charge. He planted himself directly between the drones and the compartment, soaked from head to tail, breathing heavily but refusing to retreat another inch. The young female inside the compartment placed one trembling hand on the inside of the transparent emergency panel while the three cubs gathered beside her. For the first time, I realized they were not looking at the drones. They were watching Mason. He noticed it too. Without taking his eyes off the hovering machines, he spoke in the same calm voice he had used since entering the river. Stay where you are. I am almost there. Something changed in Razek at those words. The great predator stopped watching the drones and looked directly at the human. There was no confusion left in those golden eyes. Whatever distrust had existed beneath the water had begun to disappear. Varek noticed the exchange as well, and I could almost see him recalculating the situation. This was no longer a frightened animal protecting its family alone. It had started treating the human beside it as an ally, and every second that partnership grew stronger made the commanders perfectly organized operation less certain than it had been only minutes before. The river continued rising inch by inch, pressing against the damaged compartment until the entire wreck groaned beneath the weight of the current. Warning lights inside the emergency shelter shifted from yellow to red, and for the first time I noticed a countdown flashing across my display. The backup life support system had less than 3 minutes remaining. Every person inside the rescue tower saw it at the same moment. Every person except Commander Varek reacted with urgency. He simply glanced at the timer before returning his attention to Mason as though the remaining time belonged to him. Your rescue window is closing, he said evenly. Walk away now, and this does not become your problem. Mason ignored the offer completely. He secured one end of his final rescue line around the exposed support beam and fastened the other to the emergency hatch. Then he looked through the narrow opening at the young Valari. When I pull, he said, keep the little ones behind you. She nodded once without hesitation. There was fear in her eyes, but there was trust now as well. Razek stepped closer until his massive shoulder rested against the damaged hull, adding his strength to hold the compartment steady against the rushing water. I realized something extraordinary had happened without anyone announcing it. The great predator was following the human's lead. Mason counted quietly. 3, 2, 1. He leaned backward with every ounce of strength he had while the rescue line tightened across the twisted frame. Metal protested with a deep grinding sound before one section finally broke free and drifted downstream. The opening widened enough for the young female to guide the first cub toward Mason. The smallest Valari hesitated only for a second before reaching for him. Mason lifted the frightened youngster into his arms with surprising gentleness and carried it through the swirling water to the floating rescue platform nearby. He returned immediately for the second cub, then the third, never wasting a single movement. Only the young female remained inside the compartment. Just as Mason reached for her, the damaged structure shifted again. The entire shelter dropped several inches deeper beneath the water, trapping one side beneath the collapsed shuttle. My heart nearly stopped. The support frame is failing, one of our engineers shouted. He has less than 60 seconds. Commander Varek raised one hand, signaling his personnel to remain exactly where they were. He was waiting for the river to accomplish what his team no longer could. Mason looked once at the trapped section, then unclipped the heavy rescue tool hanging from his harness. Instead of forcing the door, he wedged the tool beneath the twisted frame and used it as a lever against the riverbed. Razek instantly understood. The great Valari pressed forward at the same time, pushing against the opposite side with all his remaining strength. Together, human and predator moved the wreck just enough for the final obstruction to slide away. The young female emerged into the current, and Mason caught her before the river could carry her downstream. The instant all 4 survivors reached open water, the compartment collapsed completely beneath the flood and disappeared into the darkness. Silence spread across the valley. Even the rain seemed quieter. The 3 cubs gathered beside Razek, while the young female stood shoulder to shoulder with Mason, breathing hard but safe. Then she looked directly at him and spoke through her damaged translator. "My name is Lyra," the device whispered. "You saved my family." For the first time since this impossible rescue had begun, Razek lowered his enormous head toward Mason instead of watching him with caution, and every instinct I had developed during 15 years as a ranger told me I was witnessing something that our history books had never recorded before. Most people believe trust is built through words. They have clearly never watched a Valari make its decision. Razek remained perfectly still for several long seconds while rain rolled across his silver-black coat. His golden eyes never left Mason. Then, in one slow motion, the enormous predator lowered his head until it rested only inches from the human's shoulder. Every rescue officer around me stopped breathing. Across 3 frontier sectors, that gesture meant only one thing. Acceptance. Not submission. Not surrender. Acceptance. Mason did not celebrate it. He did not even reach out immediately. He simply stood there, allowing Razek to choose the distance between them. After another quiet moment, he rested one hand gently against the thick fur along the predator's neck. Razek closed his eyes for the briefest instant before stepping aside, making room for Lyra and the 3 cubs behind him. I had spent 15 years studying dangerous wildlife, yet I had never seen a Valari willingly place its family beside a stranger. Commander Varek saw it too, and whatever patience remained in his expression disappeared. He tapped a control panel mounted on his wrist. Within seconds, another transport shuttle descended through the storm clouds, followed by additional security aircraft that spread across the valley in a wide formation. Their engines echoed against the canyon walls until the entire river seemed surrounded. A warning signal flashed across every civilian frequency. "Restricted operation," the automated broadcast announced. "Unauthorized personnel will be detained." It was a lie, and everyone listening knew it. Varek had stopped pretending this was a rescue. He intended to leave with the survivors whether they agreed or not. Mason slowly looked across the growing line of aircraft before turning back toward Lyra. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though exhaustion was obvious in every movement. One of the cubs leaned against her leg, while another refused to leave Razek's side. The smallest remained quietly beside Mason as though it had already decided where it felt safest. Lyra noticed it and managed a faint smile despite everything happening around her. "They remember kindness," she said softly through the translator. "Long after they forget fear." Before Mason could answer, a bright holographic display appeared above Varek's wrist. "Final offer," the commander called across the water. "Transfer custody voluntarily, and your interference will be overlooked." Mason looked at the display for only a moment. "You keep using the wrong word," he replied. "Custody belongs to families, not hunters." The valley fell silent again. Varek lowered the hologram without another argument. Instead, he gave a single signal with 2 fingers. The aircraft immediately shifted into tighter formation, while several compact drones descended toward the riverbank carrying restraint projectors instead of rescue equipment. Their movement was slow, disciplined, and carefully coordinated. They expected compliance through overwhelming numbers rather than panic. Mason quietly removed a coil of rescue rope from his belt and handed one end to Lyra. "Stay behind the rocks with the cubs," he said. "Keep moving if I tell you." She accepted the rope without hesitation. Razek stepped forward until he stood beside Mason, facing the approaching formation together. Neither of them made a threatening move. They simply refused to retreat. Watching that impossible scene through sheets of rain, I finally understood why every assumption I had ever made about humans had been wrong. The strongest creature on that riverbank was no longer the towering alien predator. It was the quiet man standing beside him, and somehow everyone there, including Razek, had already begun acting as though they knew it. The first thing Mason studied was not the aircraft. It was the ground beneath them. Rain had turned the riverbank into deep mud, while floodwater continued carving new channels through the valley every minute. He looked once toward the rescue tower, once toward the damaged survey shuttle drifting downstream, and quietly smiled as though he had finally noticed something everyone else had ignored. Commander Varek mistook that calm expression for surrender. He raised one hand, and 6 security officers advanced in a careful line with portable restraint projectors held at chest level. They spread apart to remove every obvious escape route without rushing forward. Their discipline would have impressed most commanders. Mason simply waited until they stepped onto the saturated shoreline. "You are standing in the wrong place," he called out. One officer answered with a confident laugh. "We are exactly where we planned to be." Mason gave a small nod. "That is the problem." Before anyone understood what he meant, another section of the damaged survey shuttle drifted into the current and struck the unstable bank only a few yards upstream. The already weakened shoreline collapsed under the additional weight, sending a wave of muddy water across the advancing formation. Nobody was injured, but the officers instantly lost their carefully organized spacing as they struggled to regain stable footing. Mason moved the moment their formation disappeared. He did not charge toward them. Instead, he ran along the edge of the river, pulling a bright orange rescue line behind him. He looped the rope around a half-buried support beam, clipped the opposite end onto another piece of wreckage, and stepped away just as the current caught both anchors. The flood tightened the line across the narrow crossing like a barrier that had not existed seconds earlier. 2 approaching drones attempted to descend toward Lyra and the Cubs, only to find their path blocked by drifting debris redirected by the new current. "He is changing the river," one engineer beside me whispered. "No," I answered without thinking. "He is letting the river change the battlefield." Razek seemed to recognize the plan immediately. Rather than rushing forward, the great Valari guided his family behind the natural rock formations exactly where Mason had directed them. Lyra gathered the cubs close while watching the human with growing disbelief. "Does he always think this far ahead?" she asked quietly through her translator. None of us knew the answer. Commander Varek finally stepped forward himself, studying the rearranged terrain with narrowed eyes. For the first time since arriving, he was no longer controlling every variable. Mason had transformed rescue equipment, floating wreckage, and rising floodwater into obstacles that slowed every advance without placing civilians in danger. It was a strategy built for protection instead of destruction, and somehow it proved even harder to counter. One security officer attempted to circle around the flooded bank only to discover another rescue cable guiding him back toward the same narrow crossing. Another drone descended through the rain before unexpectedly climbing again to avoid colliding with drifting debris. Every adjustment they made seemed to place them exactly where Mason wanted them. The commander folded his arms as realization slowly appeared across his face. "You prepared this while rescuing them," he said. Mason adjusted the final knot on the rescue line before looking up. "I prepared it while you were talking." Even from my tower nearly half a mile away, I could feel the balance of the entire encounter shifting. The Dravik force still possessed more aircraft, more personnel, and more advanced equipment, yet none of those advantages seemed as important as they had only minutes earlier. For the first time that day, Commander Varek was no longer forcing Mason to react. Mason had quietly forced the commander to react instead, and every person watching understood that the next move would decide far more than control of a flooded riverbank. Commander Varek remained silent longer than anyone expected. He studied the flooded valley, the tangled rescue lines, the drifting wreckage, and finally the humans standing calmly beside a family that only an hour earlier had considered him a complete stranger. Then the commander smiled again, although this time it looked forced. "Very impressive," he said. "You have delayed the inevitable." Mason brushed rainwater from his rescue gloves and looked toward the dark clouds gathering over the canyon. "Delay is useful," he answered. "People have a habit of arriving when they are given enough time." I frowned because no additional rescue units had been scheduled. Our nearest support station was more than 60 miles away. Varek clearly reached the same conclusion. "No one is coming." he replied with absolute confidence. Mason shrugged. Maybe. The single word seemed to bother the commander far more than another argument would have. He immediately ordered every drone to expand its sensor range across the surrounding mountains. Their scanning beams swept over the valley in broad circles, searching for hidden aircraft or incoming transports. But the displays above our control consoles remained empty. There were no reinforcements, at least none that we could detect. While every eye followed the drones, Lyra quietly reached inside a waterproof satchel secured beneath her protective cloak. She removed a small crystal device no larger than the palm of her hand. Soft blue light pulsed inside it like a heartbeat. My mother protected this until the end, she whispered. It contains everything. Mason looked at the crystal without touching it. Everything. She nodded. Every settlement destroyed. Every family taken. Every false report that called us animals instead of people. Every transmission they thought nobody would ever hear. Even from inside the rescue tower, I could hear several officers inhale sharply. Suddenly, this was no longer about saving one family. It was about evidence. Commander Varek noticed the crystal almost instantly. His calm expression disappeared. Recover that archive, he ordered. The drones abandoned their wide search pattern and turned toward Lyra. Before they could move far, Razek stepped forward with quiet determination, placing his massive body between the machines and his daughter. Mason did not reach for the crystal. He simply looked at Lyra. Can it transmit? She checked the damaged translator attached to her wrist before answering. Only if someone reaches the emergency communications relay on the western ridge. I knew exactly where she meant. The relay tower had survived the flood, but it stood nearly half a mile away across unstable ground and rising water. Under normal conditions, the trip would have been difficult. In the middle of a storm with hostile aircraft overhead, it seemed almost impossible. Mason turned toward the distant ridge and measured the route with one steady glance. Then that is where this ends, he said. There was no dramatic speech. No declaration of heroism. Just a simple decision. Razek walked to Mason's side and looked toward the same distant relay tower. The great predator gave a deep rumble that echoed through the canyon before lowering his head once more. Lyra smiled through tears of relief. Among my people, she said softly. That means he has chosen his hunting partner. I had spent years believing humans survived because they were stubborn. Watching that moment, I finally understood the truth. Humans survive because they inspired others to stand beside them, even those who had every reason to fear them. And as Commander Varek watched a rescued family willingly place their future in the hands of one quiet man from Earth, I saw something I never expected to see in his eyes. For the first time that day, he looked uncertain.